Individuals whomst take part in the intellectual hobby known as gaming may do so for any particular reason that strikes their fancy, for there are many genres that one can partake in. For example, if one is a professional in saying gamer words, they may play first-person shooters. If they are LGBT, they will play strategy games, or if a restraining order is placed against them, they may participate in fighting games. But for the sake of this video, we are talking about autistic males who hyperfixate on one thing after they turn 10 years old, in this case, racing games. As someone who identifies as a racing game appreciator, I can safely tell you that I both love and hate racing games. On one hand, I like cars, for they make noises that upset people I dislike and go particularly fast relative to, say, the Queen of England. However, I dislike racing games because they are mostly all the same. If you look at any given racing game for sale, there is a high likelihood that you already know what the gameplay will be. You pick a car, race it around the track, upgrade or tune said car after a period of time, race some more, and maybe even change to another car every so often until the game ends. Of course, some games mix that up by crashing a car, maybe driving the car sideways, or if they so desire, driving the car in a straight line. But at the end of the day, these are all a race to see who is the fastest relative to, say, a Reddit moderator on a Friday. Many racing gamers are content with this. They just want to race the car. And this is all fine and dandy. Racing game people want to just race cars. But one quick look at the racing game releases coming out, and you realize that there are no good racing games coming out. The space is entirely dominated by simulators, which, in my honest and correct opinion, are for nerds, or in this case, nerds I described earlier. And even though I am one of those people, I really fucking hate these games because, as I previously already said, they're all the same. When all the developers are striving for realism, you must realize that at the end of the day, the end result for every single developer is to achieve the same exact goal, to be real. And as far as I am allowed to be aware, there is only one reality. So should iRacing and Race Room and Asso Corsa or whatever the hell achieve their end goal, they will all be the same because there is only one very particular way that physics exists, I think. This, my friends, is the ultimate stifling of creativity, because to mimic reality has only one answer, and true creativity has none. How many video games have a Ferrari F40 and the Nuremberg I can imagine that if you've played racing games before, you've raced this track many times, multiple times, maybe even in that same car. The graphics have improved, maybe the handling improved, but at the end of the day, you've done this before. And so, as we stand, there are only two kinds of racing games that come out: kart racers and simulators, plus minor deviations from there. What is lacking is games like Need for Speed, which at this point, this series only shouts out a mid-fart every 3 years. Why is this, you may ask? I may have answers, but I shall focus on only one for now, after some backstory. When racing games were at their peak, in the 2000s, the car was still culturally significant. Toddlers had Hummer shirts, Need for Speed made copious amounts of money, and people bought the PT Cruiser. People still liked cars as a whole. But now look at today. More and more Gen Z do not want to buy a car. They are not excited to drive. Discussions of car-based infrastructure and its consequences being disastrous for the human race are becoming very common. Children have Hillary Clinton shirts, and you cannot buy a PT Cruiser anymore. People do not appreciate cars like they used to, and regardless of the opinion you have as to why, it is a matter of fact. And so, arcade racers have dropped in popularity, as these games have previously bridged the gap between people with a passing interest in vehicles and car nerds. So now, as I've already said, there's only the two types of aforementioned racing games: kart racers, which downplay the aspect of the car and focus more on the character driving said car, thus increasing general appeal, and nerdy sim racers that only appeal to people who actually strongly dislike human beings and get quite irrational when there is a woman on the cover of the car magazine. This then brings to question, how do you develop a racing game that appeals to people who really like cars and people who don't particularly care? When the populace sees the automobile as more of a wasteful product instead of an interesting machine, how do you tell people that my Subaru Baja is actually quite neat and not dumb, thank you very much? And I think the answer could be quite simple, and that answer is storytelling with people and gameplay diversity. Ponder this in your noggin. If a game does not involve a vehicle, like a plane, or a car, or a boat, there is a fair preponderance of evidence that such a title may use the bipedal creature known as humans. And if there is one thing that is relatively, quite possibly, without question, a fact, is that people like to see people do things. We like to see heroes and villains participate in various acts of tomfoolery. I think the most popular game in the world has a person as the main character, and the best-selling racing game ever has the individual driving a go-kart. To put it quite simply, adding more of a human element to car racing games could inspire people to see more in a racing game than just car. Giving credence to the idea that humans use cars and driving them can give particular emotions. Individuals whomst play many racing games may have groaned at such a thought, for they have played many a racing game with a quote-unquote story that are so bad it pains them to think about it. And they are not without reason, as the vast non-hyperbolic majority of racing game stories, should they even have one, are quite ass. Even the most praised arcade racing game, Need for Speed Most Wanted, has a story that is appreciated less for being actually remotely good, and instead for being corny as all hell to the point it's almost funny. Yet, it's not even vital to your experience in this game to watch the cutscenes. You can skip them and just play the game, and you'll still come to the conclusion that it's pretty good. To the average racing game fan, the real story is how you customize your car and use it to progress, as racing games have a real RPG aspect to them like that. But alas, using initial D level my car is my personality kind of reasoning to explain why looking at spreadsheets is in fact a very interesting way to tune your car does not work on normal people. Yet, at the same time, it is not like there is a lack of stories around cars and other forms of media. The Fast and the Furious franchise tells the story of a private military outfit that uses sports cars instead of armored vehicles, where they fight for their family to exercise their 21st Amendment right to shitty beer. Or Ford vs. Ferrari, which tells the charming tale of the grandson of the world's second most powerful anti-Semite, who orders a very fast race car to be built so he could satiate his never-ending hatred for Italians. Storytelling with cars is possible. Where car fans see the ability to drive the same track a bajillion times in a bajillion different cars as quite the best thing ever, which it is, everyone else likely doesn't, as they cannot identify the real difference between these two, much less describe to the police officer what car they own when it's stolen. Am I advocating for stories to be rammed down into every racing game? Hell no. But if you take every well-regarded first or third-person shooter made in the last 20 years, you will find many that have weak to no story but are loved for their gameplay alone, as well as games with really good stories but lackluster gameplay that are loved all the same. And some are good enough where there is a symbiosis between the two. Yet, you cannot make the same analysis with racing games at all. The overwhelming majority of racing games with stories have those said stories being bad, with the best racing games often being held up by gameplay only. There are no racing games with bad gameplay, but with good story, at least as far as I'm aware. The best and most notable example of them having both storytelling and gameplay is Driver San Francisco. Racing game aficionados will often say that a racing game does not need a story. You just need good gameplay and to have the exact car that I want in it, and it will be a good game 10 out of 10. But I believe this is some form of malformed Stockholm Syndrome. Outside of Driver San Francisco, few devs have ever even tried to make a good story. There is a feedback loop of the vocal hardcore players saying, "We don't need a story," and devs thus putting in the bare minimum effort when they even bother to make one, and then for some reason everyone begins to bitch when it's bad and cringy. What's more, when a review of a racing game comes out, a review may say the story is bad, but leverage that fact against the game, meaning that if it had a competent story, it would be reviewed higher. People will complain when there is cringe dialogue in Need for Speed Unbound, but you will never hear people say they want dialogue removed entirely. A human element is needed in almost any form of game, but it appears that people in charge of adding it are told it doesn't matter, so they make it not matter. And that's a shame. But what is an even greater shame is that when the devs do try to put a story, but it turns out quite lame. Case in point, Grid Legends and R-Racing Evolution. These are racing games that actually have a story, with plot and characters and stakes and cutscenes between races. You can say, aha! Here are racing games with a competent story, but then I shall come back with you in saying that these stories are but window dressing for the gameplay, which is mostly mediocre. While these games are almost 20 years apart, they have the same issue, that being the cutscenes can be skipped and the gameplay never once alters or changes. Driver San Francisco, we're going back to this game, tells the story of John Tanner, a police agent, as he unravels a criminal enterprise within his comatose head. There is a cool shift mechanic after he enters this comatose state, where you can just move from car to car, allowing for interesting gameplay segments and goofy dialogue. What's more, there is a wide variety of gameplay outside of just racing, such as the infamous second-person view mission. I don't want to dwell too much on the intricacies of this game, because to be quite honest, it deserves its own video, and there are people who have talked about it with much less floaty and obtuse words than what I use. What I'm trying to say is that Driver San Francisco has a story not just told by cutscenes, but also by gameplay. When the player arrives at a mission, they can expect the plot to not only develop, but also for the gameplay mechanics to be utilized in an intriguing way. Some of the best video games of all time mix up upon gameplay by forcing players to interact with the mechanics beyond what they were previously introduced with. Whether it be by adding a new enemy, an environmental hazard, removing pieces of one's equipment, changing an area size, mixing up gameplay. Modern racing games very seldom mix up gameplay to this extent, where they often rely solely on their core gameplay physics and car roster to carry you through the game. Maybe a simulator can get away with this, but I've already made it clear I do not want every racing title to be a sim. Going back to the two games I mentioned earlier, Grid Legends and R-Racing. Grid Legends has a story mode, yes, and as far as racing game team drama goes, this is quite acceptable. However, there is very little change in the gameplay here. Your objective is always just to do the race, and the goals they set for you to do are rather trivial in difficulty. And aside for some scenarios where an opponent's car is unbelievably fast or a character crashes their car, none of the plot that occurs ever has any impact on how the cars drive and how the AI generally races against you. If this was a first-person shooter where the gameplay is always the same and the cutscenes are divorced from gameplay, people would complain. But there is such a lack of racing game stories that the first sign of there being a competent one, every single gamer gets a hard-on. To put it in a different way, if the entirety of your plot is through a cutscene, and someone can go on YouTube and understand the complete story just by watching non-interactive events, then you did not make a story mode in a game. You have made a story that is shown in between gameplay, and there is no real connection between the two. Vital plot moments should occur in gameplay and cutscenes, and the player should be able to interact with them. Or, ideally, there would be no cutscenes at all. R-Racing Evolution is the same. Gameplay is entirely divorced from the story. It does have this neat mission at the beginning where you have to come in second place, but that is about as interesting as the gameplay diversity gets there. They make no effort to tell you how cars may be used in a plot. They tell you a plot, and you race cars in between. It is in my humble opinion that if there was greater emphasis on gameplay diversity and storytelling in arcade racing games, they could feasibly sell to a greater audience. Does every game? No. Sim racers can be sim racing. Forza can get rid of the stupid pinball racing for all I care. Game devs spend a lot of time tuning these racing physics to perfection, and it is only ever used on a track. So finding more ways to interact with these physics could be fun, and based on the games I see you guys playing, I believe you haven't had fun in a while. Now, if I pull into my hat of random-ass obscurity, I can find games that have a plot sometimes, and gameplay diversity. The majority of these you likely haven't heard of. So, let me run through a list of obscure driving games with interesting mechanics. Everywhere Road Trip for the PS2. Imagine a Japanese role-playing game, but instead of everyone being little sprites, they are little cars. You drive around a small JRPG-looking town and go into different sentient cars' homes and talk to them and gain quests. And alongside racing, you play soccer and solve logic puzzles. The main goal of this game is to win enough races so you become the president, which is silly. No one can be president that easily. The Runabout series, from the PS1 to the PS2. If you enjoy the missions in Grand Theft Auto that are only the driving missions, this series is like that. Runabout is the original 3D open world driving game series, but GTA did it better, so no one cared at the time. This is a mission-based driving game where you have to perform tasks in vehicles, such as in Super Runabout, where you have to push all these limos into the water within the time limit. Or in Runabout 3, where you have to go through the most obtusely long trailing mission I have ever seen in a video game. There are not many missions in these games, particularly the first one, so the main focus is replaying missions so you can unlock more weird cars, like the boat. Critical Velocity for the PS2. Driver San Francisco is a good game, but what if it wasn't made by the loathsome French, and instead made by the Japanese? Enter the Japanese exclusive Critical Velocity. Unfortunately, this game is only in Japanese, and there is no translation patch that I'm aware of. So, this one may be a bit difficult to jump into, but if you do, hot damn. This game has way too much effort put into it for what amounts to another Ridge Racer spinoff. Lengthy-ass cutscenes, goofy driving missions, smooth jazz, Japanese-looking characters that are apparently supposed to be Americans. If Everywhere Road Trip is like a racing version of Pokemon or something, this is like a Final Fantasy RPG. If you were the weird kid who had an Xbox instead of a PS2, it is with a considerable likeness that you had the Xbox version of Wreckless, which was a really super-de-duper graphically impressive driving game like Runabout or Midtown Madness. It was okay. But I bet you didn't know that there was a sequel released only in Japan, and that it improves on everything that the original failed in, such as having more cars, an open world, running at 720p, and more missions. And the best part is that despite being a Japanese exclusive, it is entirely in English. I have a physical copy I used to play right here, but when you play it, it's all in English. Very odd, but if you like open world driving games and have a modded Xbox, good luck finding it because I can't find it for sale at a reasonable price. Racing Lagoon for the PS1. Square Enix has made 2 racing games, Chocobo Racing and this. I have said twice that a racing game is like an RPG, but unlike the other 2, which uses standard racing conventions to express RPG-ness, this is actually just an RPG. There is a cute overworld with a tiny car and you get into random encounters with other racers, and then instead of like a Pokemon battle, you do a race, and then you get parts to upgrade your car. The story oozes with that PS1 90s style, and even though it was a Japanese-only release, this does have an English patch, and is in desperate need of a re-release on the Switch or something. I feel like I have brought up one too many obscure games, so let me bring up a common one I think can be improved. Wreckfest. This is a wonderful racing game. Crashing cars is a universal appeal. It's why Burnout and BeamNG are popular, because seeing things break is a universal pleasure. However, I think Wreckfest is wasting the physics engine they have made, because the gameplay is solely focused on either doing a race or a demolition derby. Yes, there is sometimes a goofy race where you're in a bus and everyone else is in a subcompact or vice versa, plus the big crushing tracks. But overall, every event is pick the car and do the event. Let's compare this to Test Drive Eve of Destruction. This is often considered the best Demolition Derby game ever made, primarily because of the sheer variety of gameplay it has. There are 25 different events in the game, and while some are just a race or a demolition derby with different rules, there are also trailer races, car soccer, chain races, reverse race, and even Red Rover. This game takes the simple concept of crashing cars and presents you with a variety of scenarios to explore that idea with. Imagine Wreckfest physics and damage with car soccer. You will have to thoughtfully think about how fast you can T-bone the opponent with the ball, because you can damage your car just as much as his, and thus could negatively impact your ability to push said ball away from any other opponent. Of course, I'm not a game dev, so I have no idea how difficult that would actually be to implement and test, or if that idea just sounds bad anywhere but my empty head. Yet, I hope you understand what I am trying to say. There is more to be had with a car than just driving fast ahead of everyone else, then get extremely hard when your horsepower number goes up by 5. Some individuals may just see the car as a tool to go fast and hurt their ears as they eat dinner on the patio. It is difficult to explain to people why I chose to sell my Scion FRS for a Subaru Baja. It's slow as shit and looks pretty funny, but it's an interesting vehicle. It gives one emotions that go beyond what speed gives. It's about the journey and seeing what can be seen along the way, rather than just getting there fast. With its strange smells and odd noises, every trip feels like an adventure of sorts. Games like SnowRunner or Jalopy give a similar experience to that. Slow, steady, enjoying the act of driving and the obstacles one may face, not in any particular rush, but still finding issues that needed to be overcome along the way. I wish there were more games nowadays just about obstacles while driving, and giving a better example of how people can be impacted by the automobile instead of just bitching about car-based infrastructure. Does anything I just said have merit? Am I the only one who's asking for different kinds of gameplay and storytelling in racing games? Quite possibly. Most comments I see on racing game reviews just say something like, just give us a lot of cars and customization and tracks and good handling and the game will be good. And while I agree with all of that, my monkey brain can only comprehend going around the same racetrack for so long before I need a break. A coffee break. Cars and games deserve a different perspective, and that perspective sometimes lies outside of the track. And if we want to see more unique driving games, I believe devs will need to start looking outside of it. Thanks for watching.